back. Just getting everything set up. And I will have a light. It's coming on the 22nd, so in a few days. It's going to be pretty nice. 'Cause sometimes I can't see what I'm reading. Because the light in this room is not great. Alright. Chapter 51, I think we're on. Hunting for answers. What happened before? So they got chased by the claw under the waterfall. A dwarf pulled Eragon out of the water. Saphira is somewhere. I don't really remember where she went. She's just alongside them with Araya. And a bald man is threatening Murtaugh's life. And just a little side note here. There is a dwarf. Okay? I try to kind of make the characters unique to some extent because it's a lot easier to hear what's going on and kind of understand the story when somebody does that, when they're reading to you. I'll do my best. I am not doing a Scottish accent for the dwarf. I'm sorry. I might try a little bit. But I don't actually look through these chapters before, so I kind of just go. So if a character shows up, like the bald guy, it really is just whatever I'm feeling in the moment for this dude. And I'm going to kind of try to have to stick to that, right? So if I make some character talk funny, I'm going to have to talk him funny throughout 4 books. Or something like that. So we'll see. If something doesn't fit, I'll switch it around. But the dwarf will sound rough and dwarfish to some extent, if I can do it. So anyway, chapter 51. Hunting for answers. This way, snapped the bald man. He stepped back, keeping the dagger pressed against Murtaugh's chin, then wheeled to the right, disappearing through an arched doorway. The warriors cautiously followed him, their attention centered on Eragon and Saphira. The horses were led into a different tunnel. Dazed by the turn of events, Eragon started after Murtaugh. He glanced at Saphira to confirm that Araya was still tied to her back. She has to get the antidote, he thought frantically, knowing that even then the skillen ball was filling its deadly purpose within her flesh. He hurried through the arched doorway, down the narrow corridor after the bald man. The warriors kept their weapons pointed at him. They swept past the sculpture of a peculiar animal with a thick quill. The corridor curved sharply to the left, then to the right. A door opened and they entered a bare room large enough for Saphira to move around with ease. There was a hollow boom as the door closed, followed by a loud scrape as the bolt was secured on the outside. Eragon slowly examined his surroundings. Zarak tight in his hand. The walls, floor, and ceiling were made of polished white marble that reflected a ghost image of everyone, like a mirror of veined milk. One of the unusual lanterns hung in each quarter. "There's an injured," he began, but a sharp gesture from the bald man cut him off. "Do not speak. It must wait until you have been tested." He shoved Murtaugh over to one of the warriors who pressed a sword against Murtaugh's neck. The bald man clasped his hands together softly. "Remove your weapons and slide them to me." A dwarf unbuckled Murtaugh's sword and dropped it on the floor with a clank. Loath to be parted with Zarak, Eragon unfastened the sheath, set the blade on the floor. He placed his bow and quiver next to them, then pushed the pile towards the warriors. "Now, step away from your dragon and slowly approach me," commanded the bald man. Puzzled, Eragon moved forward. When they were a yard apart, the bald man said, "Stop there! Now remove the defenses from your mind and prepare to let me inspect your thoughts and memories. If you try to hide anything from me, I will take what I want by force, which will drive you mad. If you don't submit, your companion will be killed." "Why?" asked Eragon, aghast. to be sure you aren't in Galbatoric's service, and to understand why hundreds of Urgles are banging on our front door, growled the bald man. His close-set eyes shifted from point to point with cunning speed. No one may enter farther Endure without being tested. There isn't time. We need a healer, protested Eragon. Silence, roared the man, pressing down his robes with thin fingers. Until you are examined, your words are meaningless. But she's dying, retorted Eragon, angrily, pointing at Araya. They were in a precarious position, but he would let nothing happen until Araya was cared for. It will have to wait. No one will leave this room until we have discovered the truth of this matter, unless you wish. The dwarf who had saved Eragon from the last lake jumped forward. Are you blind, Ergen Karn? Can't you see that there's an elf on the dragon? We cannot keep her here if she's in danger. Ajahad and the king will have her heads if she's allowed to die. The man's eyes tightened with anger. After a moment, he relaxed and said smoothly, Of course, Auric, we wouldn't want that to happen. He snapped his fingers and pointed at Araya. Remove her from the dragon. Two human warriors sheathed their swords and hesitantly approached Saphira, who watched them steadily. Quickly, quickly! The men unstrapped Araya from the saddle and lowered the elf to the floor. One of the men inspected her face and then said sharply, It's the dragon egg courier, Araya. What? Exclaimed the bald man. The dwarf Auric's eyes widened with astonishment. The bald man fixed his gaze on Eragon and said flatly, You have much explaining to do. Eragon returned the intense stare with all the determination he could muster. She was poisoned with the skill Nabra while in prison. Only Tuniver's nectar can save her now. The bald man's face became inscrutable. He stood motionless, except for his lips, which twitched occasionally. Very well. Take her to the healers, and tell them what she needs. Guard her until the ceremony is complete. We will have new orders for you by then. The warriors nodded curtly and carried Araya out of the room. Eragon watched them go, wishing he could accompany her. His attention snapped back to the bald man, and he said, Enough of this. We've wasted too much time already. Prepare to be examined. Oh, as he said, not Andy said. Eragon did not want this hairless, threatening man inside his mind, laying bare his every thought and feeling, but he knew that resistance would be useless. The air was strained. Murtagh's gaze burned into his forehead. Finally, he bowed his head. I am ready. Good. Then he was interrupted, as Auric said abruptly. You'd better not harm him, Aaron Khan. Egraz Karn, else the king will have words for you. The bald man looked at him irritably, then faced Eragon with a small smile. Only if he resists. He bowed his head and chanted several inaudible words. Eragon gasped with pain and shock as the mental probe clawed into his mind. His eyes rolled up into his head, then automatically began throwing up barriers around his consciousness. The attack was incredibly powerful. Don't do that, cried Zephyra. Her thoughts joined his, filling him with strength. You're putting Murtagh at risk. Eragon faltered, gritted his teeth, then forced himself to remove his shielding, exposing himself to the ravaging probe. Disappointment emanated from the bald man. His battering intensified. The force coming from his mind felt decayed and unwholesome. There was something profoundly wrong about it. He wants me to fight him, cried Eragon as a fresh wave of pain racked him. A second later it subsided, only to be replaced by another. Zephyra did her best to suppress it, but even she could not block it entirely. Give in to what he wants, said quickly, but protect everything else. I'll help you. His strength is no match for mine. I'm already shielding our words from him. Then why does it still hurt? The pain comes from you. Eragon winced as the probe dug further, hunting for information like a nail driving through his skull. The bald man roughly seized his childhood memories and began sifting through him. He doesn't need those. Get him out of here, growled Eragon angrily. I can't, not without endangering you, said Zephyra. I can conceal things from his view, but it must be done before he reaches them. Think quickly and tell me what you want hidden. Eragon tried to concentrate through the pain. He raced through his memories, starting from when he had found Zephyra's egg. He hid sections of his discourse with Brahm, including all the ancient words he had been taught. Their travels through Palankar Valley, Yazak, Deret, and Term, he left mostly untouched, but he had Saphira conceal anything he remembered of Agela's fortune-telling in Solemnbone. He skipped from their burglary at Term to Brahm's death, to his imprisonment in Gilead, and lastly to Murtaugh's revelation of his true identity. Eragon wanted to hide that as well, but Saphira balked. The Varden have the right to know what they shelter under their roof, especially if it's son of a Forsworn. Just do it, he said tightly, fighting another wave of agony. I won't be the one to unmask him, at least not to this man. It'll be discovered as soon as Murtaugh is scanned, warned Saphira sharply. Just do it. The most important information was hidden. There was nothing else for Eragon to do but wait for the bald man to finish his inspection. It was like sitting while his fingernails were extracted with rusty tongs. His entire body was rigid, jaw locked tightly. Heat radiated from his skin, and a line of sweat rolled down his neck. He was acutely aware of each second as long as the long minutes crept by. The bald man wound through his experiences sluggishly, like a thorny vine pushing his way towards the sunlight. He paid keen attention to many things Eragon considered irrelevant, such as his mother, Selena, and seemed to linger on purpose as to prolong the suffering. He spent a long time examining Eragon's recollections of the Razak, and then later to the Shade. It was not until his adventures had been exhaustively analyzed that the bald man went to withdraw from Eragon's mind. The probe was extracted like a splinter being removed. Eragon shuddered, swayed, and fell toward the floor. Strong arms caught him at the last second, lowering him to the cool marble. He heard Oric exclaim from behind, "You went too far. He wasn't strong enough for this." "He'll live. That's all. That's all that is needed," answered the bald man curtly. There was an angry grunt. "What did you find?" Silence. "Well, is he to be trusted or not?" The words came reluctantly. "He is not your enemy." There were audible sighs of relief through the room. Eragon's eyes fluttered open. He gingerly pushed himself outright. "Easy now," said Oric, wrapping a thick arm around him and helping him to his feet. Eragon wove unsteadily, glaring at the bald man. A low growl rumbled in Saphira's throat. The bald man ignored them. He turned to Murtaugh, who was still being held at sword point. "It's your turn now." Murtaugh stiffened and shook his head. The sword cut his neck slightly. Blood dripped down his skin. "No. You will not be protected here if you refuse." Eragon has been declared trustworthy, so you can't threaten to kill him to influence me. Since you can't do that, nothing you say or do will convince me to open my mind. Sneering, the bald man cocked what would have been an eyebrow, if he had any. "What of your life? I can still threaten that." "It won't do any good," said Murtaugh stonily, with such conviction that it was impossible to doubt his word. The bald man's breath exploded angrily. "You don't have a choice." He stepped forward and placed his palm on Murtaugh's brow, clenching his hand to hold him in place. Murtaugh stiffened, face growing as hard as iron, fists clenched, neck muscles bulging. He was obviously fighting the attack with all his strength. The bald man bared his teeth with fury and frustration at the resistance. His fingers dug mercilessly into Murtaugh. Eragon winced in sympathy, knowing the battle that raged between them. "Can't you help him?" he asked Saphira. "No," she said softly. "He will allow no one into his mind." Oric scowled darkly as he watched the combatants. "Ilfgarn's Ordum," he muttered, then leapt forward and cried, "That's enough!" He grabbed the bald man's arm and tore him away from Murtaugh with strength disproportional to his size. The bald man stumbled back, then turned on Oric furiously. "How dare you!" he shouted. "You question my leadership? Open the gates without permission, and now this? You've shown nothing but insolence and treachery. Do you think your king will protect you now?" Oric bristled. "You would have let them die. If I'd waited any longer, the Urgles would have killed them." He pointed at Murtaugh, whose breath came in great heaves. "We don't have any right to torture him for information. Ajahad won't sanction it." Not after you've exclaimed the rider you found him free as fault. And they've brought us Araya. Would you allow him to come... Sorry. I need some water, all these gruff voices. Would you allow him to come in unchallenged? And are you so great as a fool to put us at risk? Demanded the bald man. His eyes were feral with loosely chained rage. He looked ready to tear the dwarf into pieces. Can he use magic? Can he use magic? Roared Oric, his deep voice echoing in the room. The bald man's face suddenly grew expressionless. He clasped his hands behind his back. No. Then what do you fear? It's impossible for him to escape, and he can't work the devilry with all of us here, especially if your powers are as great as you say. But don't listen to me. Ask Ajahad what he wants done. The bald man stared at Oric for a moment, his face indecipherable, then looked at the ceiling and closed his eyes. A peculiar stiffness set into his shoulders while his lips moved soundlessly. An intense frown wrinkled the pale skin above his eyes, and his fingers clenched as if they were throttling an invisible enemy. For several minutes he stood thus, wrapped in silent communication. When his eyes opened, he ignored Oric and snapped at the warriors. Leave now. As they filed through the doorway, he addressed Eragon coldly. Because I was unable to complete my examination, you and your friend will remain here for the night. He will be killed if he attempts to leave. With those words, he turned on a heel and walked out of the room, pale scalp gleaming in the lantern light. Thank you, Eragon whispered to Oric. The dwarf grunted. I'll make sure some food is brought. He muttered a string of words under his breath, then left, shaking his head. The bolt was secured once again on the outside of the door. Eragon sat, feeling strangely dreamy from the day's excitement and their forced march. His eyelids were heavy. Saphira settled next to him. We must be careful. It seems we have as many enemies here as we did in the Empire. He nodded, too tired to talk. Murtagh, eyes glazy and empty, leaned against the far wall and slid into the shiny floor. He held his sleeve against the cut on his neck to stop the bleeding. Are you all right? Asked Eragon. Murtagh nodded jerkily. Did he get anything from you? No. How were you able to keep him out? He's so strong. I've been well trained. There was a bitter note to his voice. Silence enshrouded them. Eragon's gaze drifted to one of the lanterns hanging in the corner. His thoughts meandered until he abruptly said, I didn't let them know who you are. Murtagh looked relieved. He bowed his head. Thank you for not betraying me. They didn't recognize you. No. And you still say you're Morzen's son. Yes, he sighed. Eragon started to speak, but stopped when he felt hot liquid splash into his hand. He looked down and was startled to see a dark of dropped blood roll off his skin. It was fallen from Saphira's wing. I forgot you're injured, he exclaimed, getting up with effort. I'd better heal you. Be careful. It's easy to make mistakes when you're this tired. I know. Saphira unfolded one of her wings and lowered it to the floor. Murtagh watched as Eragon ran his hands over the warm blue membrane, saying, Wise heal. Whenever he found an arrow hole, luckily all the wounds were relatively easy to heal, even those on her nose. Task completed, Eragon slumped against Saphira, breathing hard. He could feel her great heart beating with a steady throb of life. I hope they bring food soon, said Murtagh. Eragon shrugged. He was too exhausted to be hungry. He crossed his arms, missing Zarok's weight by his side. Why are you here? What? If you're really Morzen's son, Galbatorix wouldn't let you wander around a glacier freely. How is it you managed to find the Razak by yourself? Why is it I've never heard of any Forsworn having children? And what are you doing here? His voice rose to a near shout at the end. Murtagh ran his hands over his face. It's a long story. We're not going anywhere, rebutted Eragon. It's too late to talk. There probably won't be time for it tomorrow. Murtagh wrapped his arms around his legs and rested his chin on his knees, rocking back and forth as he stared at the floor. It's not he said, then interrupted himself. I don't want to stop, so make yourself comfortable. My story will take a while. Eragon shifted against Saphira's side and nodded. Saphira watched both of them intently. Murtagh's first sentence was halting, and his voice gained strength and confidence as he spoke. As far as I know, I'm the only child of the 13 servants, or the Forsworn as they're called. There may be others, for the 13 had the skill to hide whatever they wanted, but I doubt it, for reasons I'll explain later. My parents met in a small village. I never learned where. My father was traveling on the king's business. Morzin showed my mother some small kindnesses, no doubt a ploy to gain her confidence, and when he left she accompanied him. They traveled together for a time, and as is nature of these things, she fell deeply in love with him. Morzin was delighted to discover this, not only because it gave him numerous opportunities to torment her, but also because he recognized the advantage of having a servant who wouldn't betray him. Thus, when Morzin returned to Galbatorix's court, my mother became a tool he relied on the most. He used her to carry his secret messages, and taught her rudimentary magic, which helped her remain undiscovered, and on occasion, extract information from people. He did his best to protect her from the rest of the 13, not to out any feelings for her, but because they would have used her against him, given the chance. For 3 years, things proceeded in this manner, until my mother became pregnant. Murtagh paused for a moment, fingering a lock of his hair. He continued in a clipped tone. I don't know what clipped tone means, so I'm just gonna keep going. My father was, if nothing else, a cunning man. He knew that the pregnancy put both him and my mother in danger, not to mention the baby, that is me. So, in the dead of night, he spirited her away from the place and took her to his castle. Once there, he laid down powerful spells that prevented anyone from entering his estate, except for a few chosen servants. In this way, the pregnancy was kept secret from everyone but Galbatorix. Galbatorix knew the intimate details of the 13's lives, their plots, their fights, and most importantly, their thoughts. He enjoyed watching them battle each other and often helped one or another for his amusement. But for some reason, he never revealed my existence. I was born in due time and given to a wet nurse so my mother could return to Morzin's side. She had no choice in the matter. Morzin allowed her to visit me every few months, but otherwise we were kept apart. Another 3 years passed like this, during which time he gave me a scar on my back. Murtagh brooded a minute before continuing. I would have grown to manhood in this fashion if Morzin hadn't been summoned away to hunt for Saphira's egg. As soon as he departed, my mother, who had been left behind, vanished. No one knows where she went or why. The king tried to hunt her down, but his men couldn't find her trail, no doubt because of Morzin's training. At the time of my birth, only 5 of the 13 were still alive. By the time Morzin left, that number had been reduced to 3. When we finally faced Brahm in Gilead, he was the only one remaining. The Forsworn died through various means: suicide, ambush, overuse of magic, but most importantly the work of the Varden. I'm told the king was in a terrible rage because of those losses. However, before word of Morzin and the others' deaths reached us, my mother returned. Many months have passed since her disappearance. Her health was poor, and she had suffered a great illness. She grew steadily worse. Within a fortnight, she died. What happened then? Prompted Eragon. Murtagh shrugged. I grew up. The king brought me to the palace and arranged for my upbringing. Aside from that, he left me alone. Then why did you leave? A hard laugh broke from Murtagh. Escaped is more like. At my last birthday, when I turned 18, the king summoned me to his quarters for a private dinner. The message surprised me because I had always distanced myself from the court and had rarely met him. We talked before, but always within earshot of eavesdropping nobles. I accepted the offer, of course, aware that it would be unwise to refuse. The meal was sumptuous, but throughout it his black eyes never left me. His gaze was disconcerting. It seemed like he was searching for something hidden in my face. I didn't know what to make of it, and did my best to provide polite conversation, but he refused to talk. So I soon ceased my efforts. When the meal was finished, he finally began to speak. You've never heard his voice, so it's hard for me to make you understand what it was like. His words were entrancing, like a snake whispering gilded lies into my ears. A more convincing and frightening man I've never heard. He wove a vision, a fantasy of the empire as he imagined it. There would be beautiful cities built across the country, filled with the greatest warriors, artisans, musicians, and philosophers. The Urgos would finally be eradicated, and the empire would expand in every direction until it reached the four corners of Glacia. Peace and prosperity would flourish, but more wondrous yet, the riders would be brought back, to greatly govern over Galbatorix's fiefdoms. Entranced, I listened to him for what must have been hours. When we stopped, I eagerly asked how the riders would be reinstated, for everyone knew there were no dragon eggs left. Galbatorix grew still, and then stared at me thoughtfully. For a long time he was silent, but then he extended his hand and asked, Will you, O son of my friend, serve me as I labor to bring about this paradise? Though I knew the history behind him and my father's rise to power, the dream he had painted for me was too compelling, too seductive to ignore. Ardor for this mission filled me, and I fervently pledged myself to him. Obviously pleased, Galbatorix gave me his blessing, then dismissed me, saying, I shall call upon you when the need arises. Several months passed before he did. When the summons came, I felt all my old excitement return. We met in private before, but this time he was not pleasant or charming. The Varden had just destroyed 3 brigades in the south, and his wrath was out in full force. He charged me in a terrible voice to take a detachment of troops and destroy Cantos, where the rebels were known to hide occasionally. When I asked what we should do with the people there, and how we would know if they were guilty, he shouted, They're all traitors. Burn them at the stake and bury their ashes with dung. He continued to rant, cursed his enemies, and described how he would scourge the land of everyone who bore him ill will. His tone was so different from what I had encountered before. It made me realize he didn't possess the mercy and foresight to gain the people's loyalty, and he ruled only through brute force, guided by his own passions. It was at that moment I determined to escape him and Urabine forever. As soon as I was free of his presence, I and my faithful servant, Tornak, made ready for flight. We left that very night, but somehow Galbatorix anticipated my actions, for there were soldiers waiting for us outside the gates. My sword was bloody, flashing in the dim lantern glow. We defeated the men, but in the process Tornak was killed. Eragon, alone and filled with grief, I fled to an old friend who sheltered me in his estate. While I hid, I listened carefully to every rumor, trying to predict Galbatorix's actions and plan my future. During that time, talk reached me that the Razak had been sent to capture or kill someone. Remembering the king's plan for the riders, I decided to find and follow the Razak, just in case they did discover a dragon. And that's how I found you. I have no more secrets. We still don't know if he's telling the truth, warned Saphira. I know, said Eragon, but why would he lie to us? He might be mad. I doubt it. Eragon ran a finger over Saphira's hard scales, watching the light reflect off them. So why don't you join the Varden? They'll distrust you for a time, but once you proved your loyalty, they'll treat you with respect. And aren't they, in a sense, your allies? They strive to end the king's reign. Isn't that what you want? Must I spell everything out for you? Demanded Murtagh. I don't want Galbatorix to learn where I am, which is inevitable if people start saying that I've sided with his enemies, which I've never done. These, he paused, said with distaste, rebels are trying not only to overthrow the king, but destroy the empire. And I don't want that to happen. It would sow mayhem and anarchy. The king is flawed, yes, but the system itself is sound. As for earning the Varden's respect, once I am exposed, they'll treat me as a criminal or worse. Not only that, suspicion will fall upon you because we traveled together. He's right, said Saphira. Eragon ignored her. It isn't that bad, he said, trying to sound optimistic. Murtagh snorted diversively and looked away. I'm sure they won't be. His words were cut short as the door opened a hand's breadth, and 2 wolves were pushed through the space. A loaf of bread and a hunk of raw meat followed, then the door was shut again. Finally, grumbled Murtagh, going to the food. He tossed the meat to Saphira, who snapped it out of the air and swallowed it whole. Then he tore off a loaf in 2 and gave it to Eragon, picked up his bowl, and retreated to the corner. They ate silently. Murtagh jabbed at his food. I'm going to sleep, he announced, putting down his bowl without another word. Good night, said Eragon. He lay next to Saphira with his arms under his head. She curled her long neck around him like a cat wrapping its tail around itself, and laid her head alongside his. Once all of her wings extended over him like a blue tent, enveloping him in darkness. Good night, little one. A small smile lifted Eragon's lips, but he was already asleep. That is the end of chapter 51. Next chapter is The Glory of Trojanheim. I'll read that at a later date.